accept the reality of the world with which we're presented. It's as simple as...
Welcome to the show, Corey.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. I decided on a little bit of a change of focus this week. I've been sort of talking about giants and, the Nephilim for on and off for a couple of weeks now. But obviously, as part of this podcast, to talk about the unseen world. But before we get into that, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and also how you've got to doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm originally from Canada, a Canadian born and raised. I've now lived in the United States for 7 years and am a legal resident here. I was raised a poor kid in British Columbia, Canada. There was a time my family was homeless, living in a tent, and just a small boy looking at the world and wondering why, ever since I was really little. And so I often talk about how when I was 9 and 10 years old, I was super into philosophy, really got into Plato and Aristotle and Confucius, and really wanted to answer that question of why. And even at a young age, kind of discovered that philosophy doesn't answer the question of why. In fact, it asks more questions than it answers. And then as I grew up, I really turned to psychology. I wanted to understand the question why, through human behavior. And for a while, I was really into Freud, and it's just this whole concept of the development of personality with the id and the ego and the superego. And, I got to say, for all the years that I've spent dabbling there, I haven't found the answer of why. And then for a while, I really got into neuroscience. The brain is an amazing thing when you think of how it will literally change shape in response to trauma or life experience, and how we are so deeply affected by brain chemicals and the lack of them or the abundance of them, and didn't find the answer there. I quickly learned that when you're studying philosophy or psychology or neuroscience, what you're studying is mechanism. You aren't studying source. You are not answering the question of why, which is why we live in such an educated world today. And yet we're seeming to be more confused than ever because we're dabbling in all these places that do not answer the question of why. Ultimately, that led me to faith, where I believe that I found the question. But the conversations that I like to have with people kind of walk those parallel lines of my life experience of philosophy and psychology and neuroscience and theology. And therein, I believe we can discover the answers that we're truly looking for. So yeah, I've been a pastor in Silicon Valley now for 7 years. I'm an author with a new book that has just come out. And really, I'm on a mission right now to remind people that more than a brain or a body, we are souls. And one of the reasons why we see the chaos in the world today, just think of this for a second. We live in a time in North America and in here of unprecedented prosperity. And by that, I mean never before in the history of mankind has a generation or the generations that exist today been granted such unfettered access to prosperity, to education, to convenience, to leisure, to world travel. And yet virtually every study shows that we are more unhappy than ever. Right? It's because we've been looking for our answers, that question of why that has kind of disturbed me since I was a small boy in the mountains of British Columbia, Canada. We've been looking for the answer for that question in biology, in the brain and the body. And I believe if we're truly going to answer the question why, if we're truly going to identify the source of peace and happiness and hope, we have to look beyond biology, because that is what we are. We exist beyond biology.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were saying about unprecedented, we've got so many things, haven't we? And it's obviously the same over here. And it's quite sad because it's been on the news recently. In fact, I think just as recently as today regarding younger children, and they've got a campaign at the moment called like Keep Britain Talking, and it's all to do with mental health problems. And there's so much mental health problems now. I mean, I'm 44 years old and I didn't even know what mental health problems were when I was a child. But there's children now, like you said, and it's because we're not going to the right place. Like you said, we're just looking at the biology. And you mentioned your book there, and I can see that you've got your copies in the background there. They're The Magnetic Heart of God. And you've wrote in your book, I wrote a few bullet points out, and you've put, this is regarding your book, accurately diagnose our floundering personal and social condition, reintroduce you to your soul in a fresh and transformational way, clarify the true purpose and meaning of human existence, carefully map out the most reliable route to abundant life, and expand your perspective regarding God and his intentions towards you. Could you tell us your motivation in writing this book, where it began?
Yeah, well, it really began, as I mentioned, on those mountain slopes in British Columbia. It began with me leaning against a tree with my little dog beside me, looking out onto a mountain landscape and wondering why. And I think of all the places that question has taken me, right? All the literature journeys that I've gone through, all the literal journeys that I've gone through. And so ultimately, I think you had just mentioned there the mental health awareness that we have in society today. And that is such an important step that I think humanity has taken to, I mean, for throughout all of time, for that matter. It's only been in the recent decades that there's been an awareness of mental health conditions. But I would say that even this, that sometimes we misattribute spiritual health to mental health. As long as, if mental health is limited to biology, we still will not find the answer there. We exist more than a brain or a body. We are souls. We exist beyond biology. Now, everybody, or I shouldn't say everybody, but most people agree with that. Most people are aware that we exist beyond, we intuitively are aware that we exist beyond biology, and yet very few of us are living like it. And so my book is called The Magnetic Heart of God, Understanding the 5 Cravings of Your Soul. And I've categorized these cravings as soul cravings because they are sub-biology. They cannot be attributed to any kind of biological function. As an example, I'll just name one of them: identity. Every human being on earth is in search of identity. Identity asks those 4 symbiotic questions: who am I? Why am I? Do I have meaning? Do I have purpose? Right? And we as humanity are not at peace if we do not answer this question. And that is not a biological question. That's not a question that apes are asking of themselves, right? Or deer are asking of themselves. It is a human question, right? And the very fact that we have these non-biological cravings, in essence, proves the existence of our non-biological selves, right? And so my purpose in writing the book has really been to try to help people name what has gone unnamed for so long. Right? People will say all over the world, I'm looking for peace. I'm looking for happiness. I'm looking for love. And yet those words, peace, happiness, love, we treat them as ambiguous. We treat them even as if they can be defined by each individual for themselves. But the truth of the matter is they have clear definition. And if we ever want to find what we're looking for, we have to be able to identify it when we see it. We have to be able to name it. And so my ambition in writing this book is to help people say, hey, I know you're looking for peace. Here are the prerequisites for peace. They are the 5 cravings of the soul. These are the cravings that will not shut up. They are driving you forward for a purpose. And to help people name them. Because right now we have the world. I often say the earth is laced with the paths of prosperous and educated multitudes, all looking for hope and meaning, right? And yet they're not finding it for 2 reasons. They're not finding it for the first reason because they're simply looking in the biological. And number 2, they're not finding it because they don't really know what they're looking for. It's just ambiguous. We're looking for peace. Well, what is peace? Most people don't know the answer to that question. And so my goal has been to say, this is what it is. And now that you know what it is, you have a better chance of finding it.
Yeah, it's interesting you said about peace and what is peace, because I was listening to a podcast earlier today. It's actually from 2006, but they were talking about peace. And we could use the Israel Palestinian situation at the moment, and they'll say, we want peace. Well, what does that mean? Because peace to Israel or peace to Palestine can be two different things.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
So what do we mean by peace? I mean, as a Christian, I know that there's peace with God, and then there's the peace of God. And the reason there is no peace is because people don't have the peace with God.
Yeah, I
It's,
think
you know,
you're absolutely right.
it was, yeah.
When we look at when we look, sorry for interrupting, when we look, for example, at the terrible and the heartbreaking conflict taking place in Israel and Gaza right now, as you just mentioned, there are people looking for an external victory, which they think will bring internal peace. World history has shown that that does not happen. It's never enough. What we're looking for in external peace is ultimately we're hoping that it'll provide internal peace, because that is the point of which we can find unity and true rest for our souls. And so that's what I'm trying to define for people. Winning a piece of territory will not give you peace. Getting another diploma on your wall will not bring you peace. Having your bank account swell ever bigger and ever bigger will not bring you peace. History has proven this to us unequivocally, that these are bottomless pits. I remember as a kid, I thought I was making $12 an hour, and I thought if I could just make $15, I'll have everything I need to have peace. And then I made $15, and then suddenly I needed 20. If I could just make 20, I'll have peace. 25, 30, 40. Throughout all of my years, the number kept growing because it was never enough, and it is never enough. This is why a billionaire is not satisfied with 2 billion. They need 3 billion. Yeah. Right? Because we are looking to the biological to answer non-biological craving, and that simply does not work. And so when we look at the world today and all the chaos, we think of obviously the Middle East, we think of the Ukraine and all of these things that are taking place. They're horrifying, terrible things. People trying to win an external victory, hoping that that'll grant them internal peace, and it won't. This is why the world has had wars since the beginning of time, and will continue to have them until people learn to look for peace in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So we obviously, you mentioned obviously they're looking for peace, biology, you know, we'll talk about that all, it's biology. And so how would you respond then to someone that says that all humans are simply just flesh and blood? Because traditionally, you know, the science community, they dismiss the soul as just an object of human belief.
Yeah, first off, I would say that to say that science says that there is no soul is a complete misunderstanding. It's beyond the scope of science, and so science cannot say that. I'll often have people ask me, what proof do you have that there's a soul? Right? And generally what I'll say to start with is, you are your own best evidence that you have a soul. Right? There is within us. C.S. Lewis once said something very interesting. He said, creatures do not have cravings unless satisfaction for those cravings exists. Right? And then he uses several examples. He says, a baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. If there had never been such a thing as food, there'd be no such thing as a craving of the craving of hunger. Right? A duckling wants to swim. Well, instinctively, well, there's such a thing as water. If there was never such a thing as water, there would be no desire to swim. And yet we as humans have within us these non-biological cravings. As I mentioned, identity, justice, this desire within us that reaches out, that reaches beyond, that reaches into the eternal, that each one of us has. These cravings would not exist if satisfaction for these cravings did not also exist. So that's point number one. And point number two is what I often call, you know, the global uncoerced conclusion. And what do I mean by that? Is that this awareness of the soul that we all have, right, did not spread across the globe like religion did. It was not evangelized, right? When we think of the Europeans, they believed in the soul, and then they came to North America and they landed at Plymouth Rock. They did not bring a knowledge of the soul to the American natives that lived here. They brought religion, a certain kind of religion, but they did not bring the knowledge of the soul. The Native Americans who lived here already had an awareness of their soul. When the Romans, who believed in the soul, you know, when I think of Britain, right, landed their legions north of the White Cliffs of Dover, they did not come to an island and bring the awareness of the soul. No, the people, the Britons who were there already had an awareness of the soul. That's true of all across the world throughout all time. In order for all of these cultures, right, some of them living in stone huts or buffalo hide huts or grass huts, you know, some of them are hunters or hunter gatherers or farmers or fishermen. For all of them to independently come to the same conclusion that we exist beyond biology, that is as scientific a statement as you can get. It might be the most scientific statement that you can get, that you can make. And so I would say that, for as an example, the reason why there's so many religions in the world today is because all of these independent cultures were trying to explain or put a framework over what they already knew about themselves. Right? So to say there is a soul, that is as scientifically proven a statement as there is. And most people intuitively know it. Now, we aren't living like it. That's the part that kind of upsets our apple cart, is because we know that we have a soul and yet we aren't living. There is this misconception out there that for a lot of people that our soul kind of is dormant within us, that it's mute and passive and it doesn't kind of activate until we die. But then we die and boom, the soul is activated. I would say the exact opposite is the case. Our soul is bold. Our soul is insistent. Our soul is our core motivation for everything we do in life. And until we acknowledge that and become aware that there is a presence within us, in fact, a presence that is us, we'll keep looking towards biological things and never find peace.
Yeah, like totally agree with you. What is us? That is who we are. And obviously there's different cultures around the world who have different beliefs in what the soul is and everything. And I was reading today actually regarding the Egyptians and what they believed, how the human soul was actually made up. And they believed that it was made in 5 parts. And said there's a part called Ren, which is your name, the Shiot, I believe it's pronounced, which is your shadow or your silhouette, the Ka, which is your vital essence or your life spark, the Ba, which is unique personality, or your Ib, which is your heart or the seat of your emotion, thought, will, and the key to the afterlife. And like you said, that's as scientific as proof as you can get. The fact that every, nation, culture on earth has this concept, of a soul. And I believe that this age that we're living now is really the only age we've had of unbelief, where you have to tell people, there is a God, or you do have a soul, or, they've always believed, probably before Darwin, probably everyone believed in a creator at the least, and probably believed in the afterlife. But we're talking obviously about the soul. How would you define it? Like, what would you say the soul is?
Well, I would say that the soul is the essence of who we are. You just mentioned the Egyptians, I think you nailed it right on the head. If you go back through ancient history, so like for some people would say that our the most ancient written literature we have is Greek in origin. Now, I'm sure that could be widely debatable. I'm not going to take a specific side on that. But when you read the ancient literature, it is clear that they know that the soul, as you mentioned, it actually used those words, is the seat of who we are. It is the core of who we are. As time has progressed forward throughout history, then it evolved into a point where people thought, well, the soul is really our personality, right? That's how they evolved to explain it, to the point, as you mentioned, where we got to the point today where people are saying, do we have souls? Right? It's been this progression. And I would say the reason for this progression is this. We have been told, I'm a Canadian living in America, so let me just pick on America for a moment, just to be fair. There's what people call the American dream, right? And the American dream is that you get a great house and get a great family and get a great job and you drive a modern car and you're going to experience blissful existence. It's not a real thing, right? I would say ever since biblical times, for that matter, we've been told in a secular world that if we will just reach the top of that financial mountain, we'll have peace, right? Or if we reach the top of that sexual mountain, or if we reach to the top of that academic mountain, we will have peace. And ours is the generation who has reached the summit and discovered that there's nothing there. And so the next logical step is to say, I haven't found peace in money, in sex, in victory with arms. I haven't found peace in my marriage. I haven't found peace in religion. So what is the next step? The next step is to set ourselves up as God and say, maybe I will find peace, right? If I say there is no God out there, but in fact, I am God. I am the definer of truth and reality, which is exactly what we see happening in the world today. Independent translations of truth and reality, which is madness when you think about it, ultimately. But that is what we have progressed through. Why? Desperation. We've reached this point because of desperation. We keep getting more and more prosperous, and each generation keeps saying, okay, I'm prosperous, but I don't have peace. So I just need to be a little bit more prosperous. And then they pass that attitude on to the next generation, and it just keeps building and building and building, right? Until the poorest among us today has more than the kings and queens of mere centuries ago. And yet we are unhappy. We are not at peace. And if we're going to find the answer to this question, we have to get rid of the lie, which is not scientific and it is not intelligent. The lie that tells us that we are simply biological creatures, right? Looking for biological satisfaction. We have proved that to be false. We are non-biological creatures. And if we're going to have peace and happiness, we're going to have to look towards non-biological sources.
Yeah. You're interesting. You were talking about truth. And obviously one of the phrases we hear these days is tell your truth. I mean, it's one of the things that Oprah Winfrey's obviously coined. And I've often said to people that I'm not interested in your truth, not meaning it in a rude way, but I'm interested in the truth. And there is truth. We know there's an objective moral standard outside of ourselves. And we know that truth comes from God. And I've heard the arguments, and I've read online, you know, scientists who say that, well, I'll go into what Descartes said, and then I'll mention something else I read, and then I'll see what your response to this is. So one of the many arguments that Descartes advanced for the existence of the soul was the brain, which is obviously part of the body, and it's mortal and divisible, meaning there's different parts. And he said that the soul is obviously eternal and indivisible, meaning it's an inseparable whole. So he concluded that the brain obviously and the soul are different things. But then I read an argument online by a scientist who said, well, he didn't agree with that, because he says if you have, say for example, you're in a car accident and you become brain damaged, then it's clear that it's only your brain that works. If you become brain damaged, then you haven't got a soul because you can't function. So clearly there's no soul because you've suffered some kind of injury. I mean, how would you respond to someone who argued with you that way, who said, like, basically, well, no, it can't be because you've got a brain injury and you can't function now?
Well, that's kind of like saying you don't have a body because your arms don't work. You're a paraplegic, right? Because you still have a brain. Your brain is telling you to lift your arm, but your arm won't lift it. Why? Well, because it needs those signals to transfer down to. And so I would say simply this: as creations, I am not saying we are only non-biological. I'm just saying that's the core of who we are. I often describe it this is the hierarchy of our personal selves. The soul gives directions to the mind gives directives to the body. That is why, if people are looking into theology, for an example, that's why God holds the soul accountable for sin, because its ultimate motivation is in a fallen soul, right? Mm-hmm. And why the scripture says that Jesus came to save our soul, why the scripture says that God stands guard over our soul, because it is our core. Our soul is the core of who we are. It's the core of our motivation system. So the soul gives directives to the mind and the mind to the body. So when someone has brain damage, for an example, because as long as we are on earth, we are this collaboration of three parts: body, mind, and soul. They function together. If you hurt one, all of them will feel the effect. And so oftentimes I would say, it's kind of like if you have two train cars and a chain in between them. Let's just pretend that chain for a second is the mind. When that brain damage, as they say, that chain is broken, it doesn't mean the train cars don't exist. It simply means the connection point between them, right, is no longer connecting them. And so it's very interesting because you mentioned that came from a scientist, right? And yet it is very illogical, when you actually sort it out. But that is, of course, the problem we have in the world today, where you just mentioned personal truth. This is why we have personalized studies and personalized science today, right? Different political parties or powerful individuals or corporations will pay for a study, that will ultimately bring about, the results that they want, right? And and all of a sudden people say, hey, if you drink Coca-Cola, you'll lose weight. Right? It's like, what? Really? But they paid for some study, they found some way to explain this. Unfortunately, we live in a world where that's true politically, that's true in the scientific realm. And I will also say this, that is also true in the realm of, religious activity. There are a lot of people of faith from all different backgrounds who have used their position blindly or abusively.
Yeah, I had a conversation with someone at work a few months ago because somebody had a heart attack in work. And this guy who said to me, oh, that's the first time I've seen someone who's come back from the dead, because the guy came into the station the day after and thanked the staff for helping him. And I said to him, what do you mean he come back from the dead? He said, well, he died yesterday. I said, he didn't die. Well, he did because he wasn't breathing. And I said, no, he didn't die. I said, his vehicle broke down. And he looked at me like strange. I said, the body is your vehicle. I said, his vehicle stopped working, but he did not die. I said, because his soul didn't leave his body. I said, if you get in your car, I said, and you drive it around, who's driving? And he was like, well, I am. I said, exactly. I said, it's the same thing with the body. I said, your soul is in control of your body. That's, it's like the driver of your body. And I think he understood, but it's the same thing what you were saying about, it's illogical to say, well, if you've got brain damage, then clearly you don't have a soul. But like how I explain it is, your body is your vehicle. That's all it is.
Yeah.
What's the origin of the soul?
Well, I believe the origin of the soul, well, of course, this is where it gets to the aspect of faith, right? And so my personal belief is that if you read in Genesis, God breathed into man and he became a living being, is what it says in the book of Genesis, right? And I just mentioned that when you read the scriptures, you find that God holds the soul accountable for sin. Jesus died for the soul. God stands as a shepherd over our souls. It's very specific, right? It's that core of who we are. And so I think that the soul, the origin of the soul, is obviously, that is part of us that is made in the image of God. I think in Christendom today, if you ask people what it means to be made in the image of God, it's kind of, once again, people are like, I don't really know. I can tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that God has 10 fingers and 10 toes, right? It doesn't mean that God runs out of breath if he has to run uphill after he ate pizza. Those are things it doesn't mean. What it means is, and this is the part where faith comes in, and where I readily accept that other people might not be able or willing to agree with me on this point. But I believe that the soul is the core of who we are, and that God designed us, our souls, to live in connection with him. And that's what it means to be made in the image of God. We are not made to live as independent creatures. In fact, it's in living independently that all chaos erupts. And again, you can look at this in Genesis chapter 3, of the scripture, when chaos erupts, when man, doesn't believe God. They believe the serpent, right? And they are sent out of the garden onto that is the begin out of the garden on their own. That is the beginning of all chaos. And so the soul originated as the core part of us, created in the image of God. And that image within us, what is the meaning of that? What is the definition of that? To be created in the image of God means that we are designed to live in connection with him. So I'll give you an example. So when I talk about the 5 cravings of the soul, obviously in my book, I go very in depth into them, and I walk those parallel lines of philosophy and psychology and neuroscience and theology as I'm discussing these topics. But just kind of blazing through them quickly, the 5 cravings of the soul are security, identity, independence, significance, and innocence. These are the 5 cravings that are the motivating factor for all human ambition. They're what we're looking for when we get married. We're hoping to find that place of peace where we are secure, right? Where we have a connected identity, but not so much that we lose our independence. A place that we feel special, and a place where we feel like we are a good person, we are innocent. And so it's the cravings of our soul that drive us towards marriage or a relationship. And it's the cravings of the soul that lead us to divorce and broken relationship, because we realize, oh, I didn't find the security I was looking for, the identity, the independence, the significance, the innocence. That's the reason we pick a career. And that's the reason we trade careers. They're the reason why we go to war and the reason why we sue for peace. They are the core drivers of all human ambition. But here's the thing. There's only one place where they can truly be satisfied. And that is in our maker. I can't build high enough walls to make me feel completely secure. I can't do it. Just as I build those huge walls, because I'm very much aware that they could be torn down, that they could fall over, or that there just may be some foe who can leap high enough to breach them, right? You can use that for all the cravings. These are non-biological cravings, which means they cannot be satisfied biologically. The only place our cravings can be fully satisfied is in God, is in connection with our maker. And again, I mentioned at the start, that is why we see the chaos in the world today, because we see humanity hell-bent, pardon the pun, right, on trying to satisfy these cravings elsewhere, and they can't do it. And so each generation gets more frustrated, and with each step in what we may call enlightenment, right, we discover that there's no peace with that enlightenment. And so we seek a higher enlightenment, and we realize there's no peace with that enlightenment. The only place our soul cravings can be satisfied is within our maker. And that is ultimately, I believe, the origins of the soul. I think I went beyond your question there, but the origins of the soul is that God placed them within us on purpose so that we might remain in connection with him. And as a person of faith, I just think what a privilege that is, that I am literally designed to live in connection with the maker of the universe. Again, that is not true of a kangaroo. That is not true of a chimpanzee, but it's true of us. And that's something that I just feel immensely humbled in regards to.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it a bit earlier, the C.S. Lewis quote, and basically what he says is, if you find that craving within your soul that's not satisfied in this world, that's because you're made for another world.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the evidence that that you can't find this satisfaction. What operations does the soul carry out?
Right. Well, I believe that the soul is. So let me just go to the biology for a moment. So we feel the craving for hunger and thirst, and those cravings propel us towards food and water. It's a good and beautiful thing, right? Just think of this for a second. If you didn't have a craving for thirst, if you didn't crave water, you would be dead in 4 to 5 days, right? Because you wouldn't, if you just forgot to drink or whatever, and there was nothing propelling you, hey, drink that water. So that craving that you have for water is a beautiful thing that gives you the opportunity to live life. Because without it, you wouldn't drink and we would die. the cravings of our soul are the same. That's why I call the book The Magnetic Heart of God, understanding the 5 cravings of your soul. I believe that God placed these cravings within us for the purpose of drawing us back to him, in whom we can find peace and fulfillment and joy. It's that magnetic heart. It's like iron being drawn to the magnet, right? And of course, the depravity of man, the pride of man, is constantly trying to seek satisfaction in all these fallible places, and it doesn't work. You think of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, the richest men in the world, or at least they were. I'm not sure what it is today. These are the richest men in the world. They literally have everything the world has to offer. They aren't at peace. They're not what you would call happy people. In fact, who are the 2 people leading the space race? Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They have everything the world has to offer, and it's not enough. So they're looking to the stars, right? That's true of all of us. There is not enough biological materials to satisfy our cravings. Right? And so God put these cravings within us to remind us, doesn't matter how far you wander, you have within you a magnet or a compass that is trying to guide you back to your maker. And everyone sooner or later comes to this realization where they realize they have run the rat race. They have chased the American dream. The people who, we sit down on the street and we look up and we think of the person living in that penthouse, right? They're not happy, and they know it, right? And so they're looking for, this is also why you think of movie stars, right? They have all the money, all the fame, all the sex that they could possibly have, and it's not enough. So they become political advocates, and it's not enough. So suddenly they start pursuing all these different spiritual avenues. This is a progression we have seen consistently throughout time, right? And so God placed the soul within us for the purpose that those cravings would draw us back to him. Just as our craving of thirst draws us towards water, and our craving of, our hunger drives us towards food, security, identity, independence, significance, and innocence, our cravings for those things eventually have to propel us towards our maker, because he is the only place in which we can find satisfaction for those cravings.
Yeah, I like what you said there about it being a compass, and that's absolutely spot on. But one thing I was thinking about there while you were talking, I remember reading, I've got Louis Berkhough's Systematic Theology behind me on my bookshelf. I read it a number of years ago, and obviously get into the soul and everything. Do you think, so there's obviously various schools of thought regarding the soul, but do you think man is triune? Do you think he's body, soul, and spirit, or do you think that the soul is spiritual?
I think it's spiritual. I think the best way to describe us would be body, mind, and soul. And I think that even if you look at the scriptures as an example, there are times it uses the word soul. There's times it uses the word spirit. There are times it uses the word heart. And if you look into the Hebrew and the Greek, when it says the word heart, it means the seat of your person. It's the soul. That's why the scripture says the soul is deceitful above all else. I mean, the heart of man is deceitful above all else. It's the soul. It's talking about the soul, right? And so I believe that those are, just as, there are passages of scripture that say, as an example, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Well, people will say, oh, it says both heart and soul there, right? Why does it mention it twice? Well, I think there's 2 ways you can look at it. You can look at it the same reason why Jesus said, verily, verily, I say unto you, right? Or in the modern translations, truly, truly, I say unto you. You use synonyms, multiple synonyms to emphasize the primary point, right? Which I think would be a good way to explain why that happens. I think another way to look at it would be to say that it might describe a different aspect. So as an example, when it talks about the soul, we could say that it is talking about that root eternal essence of who we are. And when the scripture uses the word heart, it's describing the same thing, but it's describing the vitality and the morality of who we are. It's describing the same thing. It's just using different components, just as a hood and a door are both on a car, right? It's describing the same thing, just different elements of it.
Yeah. I've recently been reading a lot into quantum entanglement, which is obviously mind-blowing. And I was reading today that some scientists believe that quantum entanglement's a plausible scientific explanation for interconnectedness amongst living beings, the universe, and the possibility of afterlife and consciousness after death. How would you define consciousness? I know it's a difficult question, but it'd just be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I actually don't think it's difficult. I think that we oftentimes make things difficult because we have a craving for significance. Right? I mean, how could we be special if we didn't do something difficult, right? I believe consciousness is your soul. It is that inner awareness. It is the living soul. That is what consciousness is, you know, when it comes to human life. And so to me, it's I would apply Occam's razor to this particular concept, right? The idea simply being the most obvious and simple answer is likely the right one, right? You don't add complications to things and very often come out with a better answer, right? The best answer is the one that's been sitting in front of you the whole time, right? And so when it comes to quantum physics, that's why my eyes kind of somewhat glaze over at times, because I believe that oftentimes it is an attempt to over explain something or over imagine something rather than just submitting to what's in front of you the whole time, in which you intuitively know you're a soul. A maker created you, right? But rather than going, yes, I agree with that, right? What do? We enter into the quantum realm, right? And so for me personally, I believe Occam's razor applies definitely in this situation, right? The simplest, most straightforward answer is generally the best. And so consciousness is ultimately that point of this where the soul comes alive and we become a conscious creation.
Yeah. I was listening to a discussion regarding consciousness and self-awareness, and they believe that dolphins speak to each other and they actually have names, and that they tell each other their names, and that this is showing like that they're conscious and the self-aware. And also in the same conversation talking about sort of apes and gorillas, how they can recognize themselves in a mirror, whereas a dog can't. I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard anything like it. Was the first time I've ever heard anything like it. You've heard it before?
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing when they were saying that. I don't fully understand how they know that dolphins are telling each other dolphin its name.
Right.
But that's what they're saying.
Yeah, 2 chirps means this one and 3 chirps means that one, or whatever. But to me, it's also self-awareness isn't looking into the mirror and recognizing it's me. Self-awareness is recognizing what I am and why I am. And that's why it is very interesting that the human race, for all of our so-called intelligence, we lack self-awareness. Right? We can look at the circle of life and we can say, oh, look, giraffes have a long neck so they can eat the foliage way up high in the tree, right? Where the deer are going to eat it lower on the tree. And predators are there so that they're going to thin out the sick wildebeest and the sick giraffes, right? So that sickness doesn't spread through. So we could say there's a purpose for the giraffe's long neck. There's a purpose for the predators who thin out the herds and can keep them healthy. There's a purpose for the beetles and the ants that then kind of chew those dead animals up and they turn into soil. And then that fertilized soil grows greener grass. We can look at this and say, we can see the purpose in all of creation except for ourselves. Isn't that interesting? We're like, what is my purpose? Self-awareness is not looking in the mirror and recognizing, oh, that's Cory looking back at me. Self-awareness is looking in the mirror and saying, this is who I am. This is what I am, right? And this, not only that, self-awareness is when I can say, oh my gosh, I've had an ego all this time and mistreated the people all around me. And I'm now just coming aware that I've had this ego and I need to change. I need to change in order to get along with my spouse or my boss or my coworkers. That's self-awareness, right? And so it's very interesting for me to have to people say, oh, an ape, a chimpanzee can recognize itself in a mirror and somehow parallel that to true self-awareness, right? It's a grasping at straws in my, and again, I don't mean to demean anyone, right? I just think that we have chased absurdity for so long, with no one kind of pushing back, that I think it's important to push back. Hey guys, let's aim a little higher in our self-awareness category.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the guys who were talking, one of them was a scientist who was an agnostic. So I wasn't surprised that he was sort of trying to parallel humans to apes and things like that. But on a previous episode, I did an episode on mind control, but on my episode, I did like a bit of an experiment with my listeners, because I talked about how we can, in a way, we can time travel. And what I said is that you can think back to moments in the past and you can actually see them. And what I got them to do was, I said that you can see without eyes and you can hear without ears and you can speak without a mouth. And how I got them to understand it was that I said to them, right, what I want you to do now is I want you to say the word movie star. I don't want you to say it with your mouth. I want you to say the word movie star. And then I asked people, I said, can you hear it? And if you say it, you can hear it, but you're speaking without a mouth and you're hearing without ears. And then I got them and I said, now think of your favorite movie star, whoever it is. Think of them. Can you see them? Well, you can see them, whoever it is, and you see them without eyes. And I was using that as an example to sort of show people that we're not just flesh and blood. I mean, what would you say about, like, I said that it's almost like time travel, that you can think back. And I've been mulling it over, but I don't really know what I mean by that. What do you think, like, that you can see? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, whether you're calling it, time travel or memory, I mean, I talk about during an interview I did with a journalist one time. I talk about wandering the mountain slopes as a boy, asking the question of why, and with books in my hand and leaning against a tree and opening a book and being swept away, right, into different times, different places, right? And that was kind of really my beginning of my education as a young man, was this being swept away, where I could live way up in the mountains of British Columbia, Canada. Nobody knows I'm there. My parents don't even know where I am, right? And yet I can open that book and I am in 1650 Spain, right? And I'm fully engaged in that. I don't know if that's time travel, but it is definitely amazing. There's a country song by a fella named Clint Black, country singers primarily from the 90s. He says, one of the lyrics of his song says, "Ain't it funny how a melody can bring back a memory, take you to another place in time, completely change your state of mind." Right? It's one of those, you hear a song and you are swept back to a totally different place, and you can almost, it feels like you can literally smell the smells, even though they're not right there. It's like you can smell the smell, you can feel the feeling. The same is true in fear. Our brains are fascinating things in that, because I don't want to let the fascination of the brain go just because we're talking about the soul. I just want to make sure we add the soul to the fascination of the brain. But as an example, if you had a traumatic experience, or let's say 10 years ago, and then you visualize that traumatic experience again, your brain literally responds in the same way. Now, you were in a dangerous situation in that particular time, and in this particular time, you're sitting in a safe environment surrounded by people who love you. But if you close your eyes and you visualize that past experience, it releases the same brain chemicals which will swell the same glands and have your heart rate will quicken, right? Simply at the memory of something. So again, I don't know that it's time travel, but it's definitely a fascinating aspect of being human.
Yeah, it's definitely something that has got to challenge people when you put it to them. I think you'd have to be really resistant and just utterly committed to denying these things.
But why? And here's the thing: why would someone do that? I mean, that's the question. Why would you be? Well, I personally believe it's for two reasons to start with. Maybe our craving for innocence, right? We have within us, we cannot bear the thought of being guilty, which is why even liars will lie, or to defend their innocence, right? That we can't stand that feeling of innocence. Or, of course, also, if we're wrong about something, we translate it to mean that we're not significant. So that's why people will stubbornly stick to something and they will not change their mind. That's the problem with politics today too, is because it's no longer about having this open discussion about varying ideas. It's about identity. It's about significance, right? And so we can't just change our minds, or we can, but that's very hard for us. Sorry, I interrupted you. You were going to mention something else.
Yeah, I was just gonna say before we go, could you just tell us sort of like you've wrote your book there?
Yeah.
What sort of things are you on with now? Are you thinking of writing any other books, or what are you doing at the moment?
Yeah. So, right now I'm going to be starting some book tours in the next little while. Actually, I would love to make my way over to Great Britain there at some point in late 2024 or early 25. I have started working on a new book, which at the moment I've roughly entitled "The Only Thing That Counts," and it's this one. Whereas the magnetic heart of God definitely reaches faith-based conclusions. As I mentioned, it walks those parallel lines of philosophy, psychology, and theology. But in this next book, it's based on Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, which says that the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. It's very interesting because not only in the world, but even in what I would say the church today, what are the two things that people no longer understand what they are? Faith and love. Again, these are ambiguous words for most people. The only things that count, right? And yet we don't understand what they are anymore. And so that's the book that I'm working on right now. But I'm in the meantime, I've been planning tours for the Magnetic Heart of God, and I'm really excited to get this content out there. I've just seen it amazingly change people's lives. When you can finally understand what you're looking for, that means you can actually have a chance of finding it, right? And when you could finally understand what your spouse is looking for, or your friend is looking for, or your boss is looking for, when you can look at them and say, there's a disruption happening here, there's a division happening here, a disconnectedness, and you're trying to figure out how to repair it. Now you know how. You can look at, why won't my sister talk to me? There's a lot of people out there. Why hasn't my sister talked to me in 5 years? Well, you know why. It has something to do with security, identity, independence, significance, or innocence. And because you now know what the problem is, and you now know what the solution is, you can do something about it. And so that's what I'm most excited about with this book, is it brings people to a point of self-revelation where they're saying, I can finally understand what I'm looking for. I can understand what you're looking for. And because of that, now we can now work together to hopefully reach our goals.
Yeah. You mentioned obviously faith and love is something, you hear it all the time. These celebrities, I love you, I love that, I love this. They don't even know what the word means.
No.
So The Magnetic Heart of God is your book. Where can people get hold of you, Corey, and where can they get your book?
Yeah. So the central place that people could find everything would be my website, CoryRosenke.com. And there will be links to various sites there. As far as finding the book, it'll be available everywhere. If you just type in The Magnetic Heart of God, and especially if you add Understanding the 5 Cravings of Your Soul, many options will pop up for you. I know a lot of people like Amazon, but should be at 98% of bookstores across the world, so you shouldn't have a hard time tracking it down if you remember the name. But CoryRosenke.com is definitely the central place I could send people to get the most information.
Thank you for that, Corey. I mean, sometimes on this show, we're touching topics that can become quite dark and heavy. Sometimes I've been quite depressed after doing some research, but it's been a nice change to, you know, switch gears and speak about like the unseen, which is the soul. So I thank you very much for your time today, Corey. Thank you to all my regular listeners. If you could just leave me a 5-star review if you're a regular listener and liking this show. I'll be back next week with another guest talking about something completely different. So welcome to any new listeners as well. Hopefully you'll join me again. Thank you again, Corey. And hopefully come back next week, guys, and listen to me, Paul, on Beyond the Paradigm.